Why should we be afraid when death is not the end? This is the Buddha's answer. Life is a constant ebb and flow, and one of the most universal fears we face is the fear of death. If death is a natural, inevitable part of the cycle, why do we fear it so much? The Buddha's teachings offer a profound perspective, one that can help us live without fear. But how does understanding death in a Buddhist way change our perspective on life? Let's take a deep dive into this question, not only through the lens of Buddhist teachings but also from a modern perspective. In this video, we'll explore why we fear death, how we can begin to live with less fear, and ultimately, how embracing death can help us live more fully. Chapter 1. What are we really afraid of? When we think about death, it's easy to picture the end of our physical existence. The idea of ceasing to exist in this form is, undoubtedly, a source of fear for many. But at a deeper level, what we are really afraid of is not just the end of life. It's the fear of losing our sense of our identity, our memories, everything that gives us a sense of being real, significant, and connected to the world around us. The fear of losing the self is one of the most powerful forces that shape our lives. We often see ourselves as something permanent, something too important to simply vanish. But what if we're not as permanent as we think? What if the idea of a fixed I is simply an illusion? Buddhism offers a radically different perspective on this. According to the teachings of the Buddha, the notion of a fixed, unchanging self is an illusion. The concept of anatta, or no self, challenges the belief that we are independent, permanent entities. Instead, we are a collection of constantly changing elements, our thoughts, our feelings, our body, and even our memories. These elements are fleeting, momentary, and never truly ours to possess. We identify with them, but they are not the essence of who we are. Consider the analogy of a child holding onto a balloon. When the balloon slips from her grasp, it's not just the balloon that is lost. There's a deeper feeling of loss, as if something important has been taken away. Similarly, we hold tightly to our sense of self, our roles in life, our achievements, our relationships, and we fear losing them. But is this fear necessary? Is it possible to learn to let go of this attachment and live without such overwhelming fear? The fear of losing the self is deeply rooted in our human experience. From personal experience, it's easy to understand why we fear death. It's not just the end of life, it's the fear that we might be forgotten, that our existence might amount to nothing. We want to leave a legacy, to prove that we mattered. But the reality is that no matter how hard we try, everything eventually fades. Our bodies decay, our relationships change, and even the most significant achievements eventually fade into the past. The Buddha's teachings help us shift our mindset. Instead of fearing loss, we can focus on what truly matters in the present. One of the core teachings in Buddhism is the impermanence of all things. Known as anicca, the Buddha taught that everything in life, including our sense of self, is in a constant state of change. Nothing is permanent. Everything is subject to birth, decay, and death. This includes our identity, our roles, and the attachments we hold dear. The more we resist this natural flow of change, the more we suffer. But when we learn to accept the truth of impermanence, we can begin to release our attachments and alleviate our fears. Let's look at this concept in more depth. The fear of losing the I often comes from an attachment to a fixed identity, a sense of who we are that we believe to be permanent. We define ourselves through our relationships, careers, and possessions, and these external markers give us a sense of security. However, these things are all impermanent. Our bodies change, our circumstances shift, and people come and go. As these things change, so too does our sense of self. The more we identify with these transient aspects of our existence, the more vulnerable we become to the fear of loss. In Buddhism, the practice of mindfulness and meditation helps us see that our sense of self is not fixed, but constantly evolving. Through mindfulness, we become aware of how our thoughts, emotions, and physical sensations arise and fade. We begin to see that we are not our thoughts, nor our emotions, nor our bodies. We are the awareness that observes these transient phenomena. This realization is liberating. It helps us detach from the belief in a fixed I, and instead experience life as it truly is, moment by moment. When we can accept the impermanence of life, we begin to let go of the need to cling to our identity. The attachment to the I no longer controls us, and we become free to live more fully in the present. We can enjoy our achievements and relationships without the fear of losing them, knowing that everything is fleeting. This does not mean we stop caring about the people and things we love, but we no longer tie our worth to them. Our happiness and peace no longer depend on the preservation of a fixed self-image. The teachings of the Buddha on impermanence and no-self offer a path toward freedom from fear. By letting go of the need to control or hold onto a fixed identity, we can embrace the fluid nature of existence and find peace in the present moment. This is not to say that we should live in a constant state of detachment or indifference. On the contrary, it is about engaging fully with life, but without the fear of losing ourselves. It is about being present, accepting change, and finding joy in the process of living rather than the end result. In the end, the fear of losing the I stems from our attachment to the illusion of permanence. By embracing the Buddhist teachings of impermanence and no-self, we can break free from this attachment and live a life of greater freedom, wisdom, and peace. We can find comfort in knowing that we are not defined by any single moment or experience, but by our ability to embrace change and live fully in the present. By letting go of our attachment to the self, we open ourselves to a deeper understanding of life and the universe. We begin to see that we are part of a vast, interconnected whole, where everything is in constant motion. The fear of loss diminishes when we realize that nothing is truly ours to keep, and that our true essence lies in the awareness of the present moment, not in the preservation of a fixed identity. This insight leads to a life that is free from fear, full of peace, and in harmony with the natural flow of existence. Chapter 2. Is death really the end? The Buddha's teachings on life and death invite us to reconsider our deeply ingrained beliefs about mortality. Rather than viewing death as an abrupt and final termination, he teaches that death is part of an ongoing cycle, much like the changing of seasons or the rising and setting of the sun. Everything in existence is impermanent, subject to birth, decay, and dissolution. This truth is central to the Buddhist understanding of life and death. The concept of impermanence, or anicca, helps us see that death is not a standalone event. It is simply a moment in the continuous process of change. The body we inhabit, like all things, is subject to the laws of nature. It arises, flourishes, and eventually fades. Yet, in Buddhism, death is not viewed as the end of the individual but rather a transformation, a transition into a new phase of existence. This cycle of life, death, and rebirth is known as samsara, the wheel of existence that continues infinitely, with each life leading into the next. The Buddha's insight into life and death is grounded in the understanding that nothing is permanent, not even the self. We often cling to our identities, our thoughts, and our experiences, believing them to be the essence of who we are. But the Buddha teaches that all of these things are transient. The self, too, is an illusion. What we call I is not a fixed, independent entity, but a collection of changing thoughts, emotions, and experiences. Once we recognize this, the fear of death lessens, as we understand that we are not bound to any one form or identity. Consider the analogy of a flower. A flower blooms, reaches its peak, and eventually wilts and dies. but in its death, it returns to the earth, nourishing the soil for new growth. In the same way, death in the Buddhist view is not an ending but a return to the greater whole. A transformation that allows for renewal, just as a wave in the ocean rises and falls, only to rise again. Life and death are part of an eternal flow. Each death makes room for new life to emerge. This view is also deeply connected to the Buddhist teachings on anatta, or the concept of no self. The idea that there is a permanent, unchanging self is what fuels our fear of death. We fear the loss of this self, believing that without it, we cease to exist. But if we can let go of the illusion of a fixed self, we can begin to see death as just another natural process, like the changing of a leaf in the wind. Our consciousness, like the flame of a candle, continues its journey in different forms, transcending the limitations of the body. Moreover, when we let go of our fear of death, we can fully embrace life. The awareness that life is fleeting and impermanent encourages us to live with more intention, appreciation, and presence. We stop clinging to what is temporary and begin to focus on what truly matters: the love we share, the wisdom we cultivate, and the peace we experience in the present moment. The Buddha teaches that true freedom comes from understanding that life and death are inseparable, that we are part of a vast, interconnected web of existence. In the end, the fear of death dissipates when we embrace its impermanent nature. Instead of seeing death as the end, we come to understand it as a continuation, a necessary part of the cycle of existence. By accepting that death is not an end but a transformation, we can live with greater peace, letting go of the fear that often clouds our lives. This understanding brings us closer to the ultimate truth, that life, in all its forms, is a fleeting, beautiful, and interconnected journey. Chapter 3. The Nature of Suffering. Suffering, according to Buddhism, arises from attachment, the attachment to things we cannot control, especially our bodies and identities. We cling to life, relationships, and possessions, hoping they'll stay the same. But nothing in the world is permanent. The Buddha teaches that by clinging to the illusion of permanence, we create unnecessary suffering for ourselves. This is a powerful message. We suffer not because death exists, but because we resist the natural flow of life and death. The fear of death stems from this attachment. In Buddhist philosophy, suffering is deeply intertwined with the concept of dukkha, which signifies the inherent unsatisfactory nature of existence. The Buddha outlined that our attachment to the things we hold dear, our relationships, material possessions, and even our sense of self, is the root cause of suffering. As humans, we tend to form strong attachments to these temporary things, desiring them to remain constant. However, this desire is often in conflict with the reality of impermanence, leading to frustration, disappointment, and ultimately, suffering. Take, for instance, the attachment to the body. We hold on to our physical form as if it is permanent. But the Buddha teaches that this body, like everything else, is in a constant state of change. Aging, illness, and eventually, death, are all inevitable parts of the process. Our desire to cling to youth, beauty, or health only creates distress. As we are constantly battling the natural flow of time, the body will change, no matter how hard we try to hold on to it. This acceptance of impermanence is central to freeing ourselves from the suffering associated with attachment. Imagine holding a handful of sand. The tighter we grip, the faster it slips through our fingers. The same goes for life. If we grip too tightly, we only end up suffering more when things inevitably change. Our relationships, careers, possessions, and even our physical health are all subject to change. But by accepting that everything, including us, is in a constant state of change, we can let go of this fear and anxiety that comes with trying to control the uncontrollable. The Buddha invites us to understand that everything we cling to is impermanent, And thus, our suffering is rooted in this resistance to the natural flow of life and death. It's easy to say that we should simply let go and accept impermanence. But in reality, it's much harder to practice. I've found that learning to let go isn't about being emotionless or indifferent. It's about accepting the natural flow of things without fighting it. We can grieve the loss of a loved one, but we don't have to let it consume us. Grief, sadness, and sorrow are natural responses to loss. But the Buddha teaches us that when we hold on to these emotions or the desire to bring back what we've lost, we only add to our suffering. Instead, we must acknowledge our feelings, allow them to arise, and then let them go, knowing that they too are impermanent. Acceptance of impermanence doesn't mean we stop caring about the things and people we love. It simply means we stop trying to control them, or expecting them to remain unchanged. Relationships, for example, are subject to growth and change. People evolve, circumstances shift, and what once felt like a constant may no longer be the same. But when we let go of the attachment to the way things were, we free ourselves from the anxiety and pain of holding on to an idealized past. In practice, letting go is an ongoing process. It requires mindfulness and self-awareness to see when we are grasping at something or someone, holding on to it tightly in fear of loss. We can apply this awareness through meditation, which helps us cultivate detachment from our thoughts, feelings, and attachments. In meditation, we learn to watch our thoughts as they arise, without clinging to them or pushing them away. This process mirrors the practice of letting go of attachment in our daily lives. The Buddha also teaches that the root of suffering is ignorance, not seeing the truth of impermanence. We fail to see that everything we experience is in constant flux. Our sense of self, which we believe to be fixed and permanent, is actually an illusion. There is no permanent I that exists independently from the world around us. Instead, we are a collection of experiences, thoughts, and sensations that arise and pass away. The more we cling to the idea of a solid, unchanging self, the more we suffer when it inevitably changes or disappears. By understanding the nature of suffering and the role that attachment plays in it, we can begin to practice detachment, not as a means of rejecting the world around us, but as a way of living more peacefully. We don't have to fight against change or death, but we can learn to embrace them as part of the natural cycle of life. When we release our attachments and accept the impermanence of all things, we can find true peace, free from the constant fear of loss. In the end, true peace comes from realizing that everything is transient, and that we are not bound by the things we cling to. By practicing mindfulness and cultivating awareness of impermanence, we begin to see that the source of our suffering is not the inevitable changes that life brings, but our resistance to those changes. When we let go of our attachments, we open ourselves to a life of greater freedom, joy, and peace, free from the burden of clinging to the illusion of permanence. Chapter 4. Living fully without fear. Living fully without fear is a core aspect of Buddhist teachings, and it revolves around the deep understanding that life is impermanent. The Buddha did not want us to fixate on death, nor to fear it, but rather to live with an awareness of its inevitable presence. This awareness does not create a sense of dread, but rather opens the door to living more fully in the present moment. The Buddhist concept of impermanence, anicca, is a powerful lens through which we can view life. Everything is in a constant state of change, and this truth allows us to let go of our attachments to the idea of permanence, especially the attachment to our own existence as a fixed entity. The fear of death often stems from a deep attachment to our sense of self and the belief that we are separate, isolated beings with a fixed identity. This fear is compounded by our desire for control over our lives and the uncertainty of what comes after death. We try to grasp at fleeting moments, relationships, and accomplishments, fearing that without them, we will cease to exist. This constant preoccupation with an unknown future or the fear of what lies beyond death robs us of the present moment. We become so fixated on holding onto the things we fear losing that we fail to truly experience life as it unfolds. The Buddha encourages us to practice mindfulness and cultivate an awareness of the present moment, which is where life truly happens. By letting go of the fear of death, we can embrace the impermanence of all things, including our bodies, thoughts, and emotions. When we understand that all things, including ourselves, are temporary, we can appreciate the beauty and value of life without the need for permanence. Instead of fearing what is beyond our control, we shift our focus to what we can control: our actions, our thoughts, and our ability to appreciate the fleeting moments that make up our existence. When we stop fearing death, we are no longer held back by the weight of uncertainty. We can live more freely and authentically, embracing life with all of its joys and challenges. This shift in perspective allows us to let go of the unnecessary attachments that cause suffering and to live with greater intention. Instead of clinging to the idea of a permanent self or obsessing over the future, we can engage fully with the present, experiencing life in all its richness. This understanding is not about ignoring the reality of death or pretending that it doesn't exist. It is about accepting death as part of the natural flow of life and recognizing that it does not define us. Death is simply a transition, a part of the continuous cycle of existence. By seeing death in this light, we can approach life with a sense of freedom, knowing that each moment is precious and that our time here is limited. This recognition deepens our appreciation for life itself, allowing us to live with more mindfulness, more compassion, and more joy. In practice, living fully without fear means being present in every moment, appreciating the simplicity of life, and accepting the uncertainty of the future. It means letting go of the need to control every outcome and trusting that the path we are on is as meaningful as the destination. By accepting impermanence, we open ourselves to the beauty of the present, where all experiences, both good and bad, are part of the human journey. This acceptance allows us to live with greater peace and contentment, free from the anxiety that often comes from fearing the unknown. When we live with an awareness of impermanence, we also develop a deeper sense of gratitude. Gratitude for the time we have, for the people we encounter, and for the experiences that shape us. By embracing the fleeting nature of life, we learn to cherish each moment, knowing that it is precious and irreplaceable. This shift in mindset not only frees us from the fear of death, but also enhances our ability to live with purpose and compassion. Ultimately, living fully without fear is about accepting the inherent uncertainty of life. It's about letting go of the need for control and embracing the beauty that arises from impermanence. When we stop fearing death, we are free to live with greater intention, appreciation, and joy, making the most of every precious moment. Through this practice, we can find peace, knowing that life's transience is what makes it so valuable. Conclusion: death is not to be feared. The Buddha's teachings encourage us to view death not as something to fear but as an inevitable part of the natural cycle of life. In understanding death, we are not just acknowledging its inevitability, but also recognizing that it is intrinsically connected to life itself. The cycle of birth, growth, decay, and death is part of a greater, continuous flow, and each phase holds meaning and purpose. When we embrace impermanence, we stop clinging to things, people, or even the idea of a permanent self. This attachment often causes us pain, as we resist the truth that everything is temporary. By letting go of this attachment, we open ourselves to the possibility of living more fully in the present moment. Instead of fearing death, we can focus on how we live our lives now. What matters is how we choose to live, the kindness we show to others, the gratitude we cultivate, and the wisdom we seek. Death will come to all of us, but it is not our focus. What truly matters is how we live today, with intention, love, and mindfulness. In the face of death, we often find that we are motivated to live more consciously. The awareness of our limited time makes us more present, more willing to embrace each moment with open arms. When we understand that our time here is short, we begin to prioritize what truly brings us joy, peace, and fulfillment. We focus on relationships, personal growth, and finding inner peace, rather than on accumulating possessions or chasing fleeting desires. As we reflect on the Buddha's teachings, we come to see that death is not something that needs to be avoided or feared. Rather, it is a teacher, reminding us to live with mindfulness and appreciation for the preciousness of life. When we live with this awareness, we free ourselves from the anxiety of trying to control what is beyond our control. We become more at peace with ourselves, more compassionate toward others, and more present in our daily lives. By embracing the impermanence of life, we find the courage to live with a heart full of love, and a spirit open to whatever comes next. Death does not rob us of life, rather, it gives us the opportunity to fully embrace every fleeting moment, knowing that it is in this very transience that life's true beauty resides.